I do not understand why industrials are allowed to produce and to put in the supermarket some product with something inside which is questionable.
From a hygiene point of view, it's definitely much better now.
I've read that there's a lot of antibiotics in the chicken meat, so I rather eat beef. But I know that beef is bad for the environment, so you're a bit stuck.
I find that the packaging is more detrimental to the food than possibly going to a market and being able to buy food that's loose.
The norm is you're not going to get food poisoning.
Before you didn't have the date, but the quality was good. Now when you have the date, but what they put in it is quite worrying, I think.
Getting a genetically modified food onto the market, it's a bomb. It's a time bomb.
I trust the EU more than I trust the 20-year-old blogger.
I don't trust to science or government because I think they work with multinational.
Scientists cannot be totally right, but if there's any update, it is wise for us to listen to them.
I probably would trust the scientists. I don't necessarily trust what is put out to us from the government.
I believe it just on my nose and my eyes, that's it.
Now it's the world of the fake news.
It's really hard to know who to believe.
I just follow more bloggers than scientists.
We are eating also the food, so they should listen to us.
If you put as much money into organic agriculture as you do in pesticides, then we've solved all these problems years ago.
If you get something from far away, it should be more costly, so you're incentivized to buy local.
I think the scientists should tell the governments that the health of the people is more important than the money.
The food agency is definitely doing a good work, but as I said, they should be listening more to citizens' concerns.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage the Executive Director of the European Food Safety Authority, Bernard Earle.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Parma, and welcome to EFSA's third scientific conference. Now it's time to put our science into context and perspective. I'm very happy that I can stand here today and welcome you in a huge crowd, I would say, and we will come back to the term of crowd more than once in this conference, here to join with us the next 3 days. You have seen in the video clip people interviewed in the streets and parks and the markets of Brussels, and they expressed very well, I think, their thoughts about the food we buy, about desire for nutritious, sustainable, tasty, but above all else, safe products. And you have seen their expectations towards governments and responsible authorities. And we have all heard their request that citizens' concerns should be better considered. Some of the contributions reminded me of the time when I was in the late teens, growing up on a small but quite intensively operated pig farm in Austria. When I started to think the way we raise our animals, it's not cruel in that way, but still, it is hidden from the eyes of the consumers. We cannot show it to them. And it struck me even then, before I studied veterinary medicine, that something was wrong with that. So already at that time, a central thought was taking shape. If we only have anecdotal information, you could call it even folklore, about food production, but without real transparency, there will be distrust and in a way we are even producing our own scandals. And that desire for transparency has only grown because also changes in our food production system and the fact that today's consumers are more removed from primary agricultural production than previous generations. We are here in these days to share views on how we can better give citizens the answers and the protection they ask and they deserve. You may remember that a Europe that protects is the motto of the current Austrian presidency. We are also here to reflect on the complex relationship between science and society and on the conditions that are required to ensure trust in our work. Our theme for the next 4 days is Science, Food and Society. It builds on our 2 previous conferences, the last one at the Expo in Milano in 2015 under the umbrella Shaping the Future of Food Safety, and previously in 2012 here in Parma, focusing on challenging boundaries in risk assessment, sharing experiences. I'm delighted to welcome back some of you, and I'm also delighted to welcome many of you for the first time. We received many registrations for this event, but we had to limit it at 1,000 participants due to the room we have available, and they are coming from more than 70 countries, from within and outside Europe. We welcome an impressive mix of disciplines, backgrounds and affiliations, with EFSA's traditional core disciplines, you could say, like natural scientists in chemistry, in toxicology, in nutrition, sitting alongside with social scientists, data scientists, communication scientists. I see colleagues here from national food safety agencies, from research institutes, from international organizations, EU institutions, representatives of the civil society and other stakeholder organizations, colleagues from our sister agencies, EFSA staff and many more. And I think this is also a strong sign that our science and we are not working in isolation. If we have a look at the program, we talk about the triangle of science, food and society. And this triangle is full of energy, expectations, and sometimes, of course, also full of tensions. Science, in its core, strives to understand nature by formulating hypotheses as objectively as possible. Risk assessment, now regarded as a distinct science discipline, supports regulatory decision-making by answering questions posed by society using a well-defined scientific methodology. However, if we apply risk assessment outcomes to food safety, sometimes it feels like throwing an ice cube into a stream of glowing lava. They are inevitably consumed in the powerful mix of culture, values, expectations. And the scientific risk predictions becomes entangled in a web of concerns and hopes. Looking at the society we live in, we see how quickly and how powerfully individual concerns can be bundled, can be augmented, can be echoed by like-minded citizens. We see how influential social movements can be in political decision-making. And this has been long regarded as a positive development, promoting empowerment, liberation, and democratization of knowledge. However, more recently, society has begun to realize that there can be a downside which lead to extreme polarization, conspiracy theories, authoritarianism, to alternative facts, and the equality of truth and falsehoods. Many of you will agree that the manipulation of the big social platform has become a threat to the liberal democracy itself. Unsurprisingly, the main bill of our conference will be dedicated to the science of risk assessment. This broad field will be addressed in parallel sessions covering a wide range of topics, from relatively well-established fields such as nanomaterials or next-generation sequencing, to more emerging topics like blockchain technology, artificial intelligence, the exposome, and software-based toxicity prediction. As with all technological advances, one of the key questions for us this week is how can we harness their potential effectively in order to better protect our citizens? And do so mindful of key societal issues such as the perceptions of risk and the expertise in what we call a post-trust, maybe not a post-truth, but a post-trust society, and the potential of engaging with the crowd to address food safety concerns more effectively. And I think if you look into the program, we can say our organizing colleagues have orchestrated a rich menu, a multi-course Parmesan festive day dinner. I guess our heads will be full and saturated with ideas when we close on Friday. When we go back at EFSA to our daily science, we say we define the scientific value of our outputs by the degree of fulfillment of 4 criteria: impartiality, methodological rigor, transparency, and engagement. Scientific excellence would mean that all 4 criteria are met to a very high extent and in a timely manner, which is only possible with a high investment in time and money. And like all publicly funded bodies, obviously our resources are finite and we have to deliver value for money. Hence, our risk assessments have to focus on being fit for purpose. And this tension between scientific value, which we are striving for, which the risk managers are striving for, and resource input, on the other hand, makes us waiting and hoping for advances such as developments in computational capabilities and the broad field of artificial intelligence. Could, for example, some steps of the critical appraisal of evidence be outsourced to machines? On a related note, we expect disruptive innovations in the data sciences and the exploitation of data. As with other domains, the tsunami of data is revolutionizing the field of risk assessment. So I ask myself, will it be possible to organize the constant flow of evidence, newly generated evidence in, let's say, toxicology, epidemiology, or exposure, in a way that the pieces of evidence, when they come and are connected to us, are on the go, embraced and supplemented with metadata in the moment they are linked to our data systems? Would this allow us to update our scientific opinions whenever needed with a minimum human intervention? Would we have something like a living scientific opinion? Will this also mean that the extent of human brain intervention in scientific assessments will depend on the desired scientific value of the outcome? And for some purposes, this process could be fully automated? Looking at the speed of change outside our domain of food safety risk assessment, I ask myself 2 more questions. How can we keep in our methodological innovation capability pace with the innovation power of agri-food industry? How can we avoid lagging behind substantially, which, translated into the risk assessment paradigm, would mean that we have to cover data gaps and methods gaps with additional uncertainty factors? Secondly, I ask myself, how can we keep a small organization like EFSA agile enough to be able to absorb the complexity of future challenges? And here I would like to mention Ross Ashby, who was a British pioneer in cybernetics of the last century, and he stated his law of requisite variety already in 1956. He defines variety as a measure of the complexity of a system. I think that's fine. And he postulates only variety can absorb variety, which means for controlling a complex system, one has to provide the same complexity on the controller side. For me, this translates into one of the most challenging management tasks of the future. How can we create, attract, and preserve enough fluid structures and fluid intelligence in our organizations to be able to absorb emerging complexity and to be prepared for that? And this aspect of preparedness plays out at different levels. One is our core scientific area, in the sense that being prepared for emerging risks and new hazards created by and introduced by innovation, by trade, by climate change, by migration, by other drivers. But this also plays out on the data science domain, where we have to be able to respond to crisis situations with tracing capabilities that can plow through the complex agri-food supply and distribution networks. And lastly, and maybe most challenging, this also plays out on an intellectual level. How will we be able to make sense of all the vast amount of data, information, and knowledge in order to support policymakers in taking the right decisions for the public good? Obviously, there's not one magic bullet for the scientific challenges and opportunities we face. However, one almost magic enabler is available, and it's in our hands to apply it. It is the power of collaboration. And with collaboration, I mean not only working together on an ad hoc basis. I mean with it three different things. The first one is being connected with knowledge hubs, especially those outside our traditional scientific domains. This means we try to organize knowledge we don't yet have, but we won't be able to use it if we need it. It also means collaboration unlimited. That is a strong commitment to overcome the activation energy and to absorb the additional complexity which collaboration entails. It doesn't come without a price. And lastly, I mean co-designing. We have to go a step further and co-design the processes, networks, systems of the future. No standalone anymore. I hope this conference will be crucible and it will be a catalyst for many more successful collaborations. Ladies and gentlemen, until this point, we could say, well, it's about science, it's about collaboration, it's about challenges, about opportunities for our scientific business, like growing complexity of questions, a more holistic wish of society to be protected, resource constraints, how to integrate new technologies into our risk assessment. We could stop here and, metaphorically speaking, we could go home. However, our risk predictions are linked to food. We are not talking about the risks of the cable car business, although this is also very important. The emotional power of food catapults our cool, dispassionate opinions directly into the center of a heated value debate. It is a debate about the food production systems, the environment, health, waste management, sustainability, even equality. Issues strongly associated with our core European values, you might say. So citizens ask, why do my children have to eat food with multiple chemical residues? And we answer and say, well, looking at it individually, up to 0.5 milligram per kilogram body weight, there's no unacceptable risk. Obviously, we are not answering the real question, and the citizens remain concerned. And citizens realize that there are many interests involved in the agri-food system. So they ask the questions, can we trust that the outcome of a risk assessment is unbiased? And by exposing society to the outcomes of our risk assessments, we enter into the fascinating realm of trust. The crisis of trust was the headline of the Edelman Trust Barometer in 2017. And we all lost in trust, governments, business, media, NGOs, regulators. It was the year of the crisis of trust. So we can ask the question, does trust matter in risk assessment? In a way, we experience a paradoxical situation because we call science organized skepticism, meaning we are eager to disprove the hypotheses of our colleagues in order to replace them with ones that are closer to truth. No trust, just skepticism. However, when we have finalized our work and we published our opinions, we turn the coin and tell the public, we have done a great scientific work, you can truly trust the outcomes. No skepticism, just trust, please. So maybe we should be more scientific in this respect and not ask for trust, but maybe for a more reasonable, contained amount of healthy and constructive skepticism. And obviously there's an observation that we have experience in, that distrust comes specifically into play when the risk prediction is in conflict with a personal or a political value. So the motto is, if a risk assessment contradicts my values, something must be wrong with it, because my values are right. There must be something wrong either with the data or the methodology or the experts. And some of you may remember at our last conference in Milan, it was Sheila Jasanoff from the Harvard University who framed risk assessment as a non-pure science. I mean, she didn't call it a dirty science, but she said it's a non-pure science, full of value judgments. Whereas Sir Mark Walport, the then chief scientist of the UK government, he warned against transforming natural science into a polling exercise. So at EFSA, we consider engagement with society as extremely important for two key reasons. One is we want to inform our science via open calls and public consultations and discussions. And on the other hand, we want to ensure accessibility and relevance of our work. So it's really a mutual win-win we want to create with engagements. This is why we pursue what we call the open EFSA strategy. Concerning science and society, we would like to get a few insights from this conference on how can intelligent transparency and engagement be put in practice. But also the question where in our pure scientific objective risk assessment process there might be hidden value judgments, and how can we and where can we involve society in getting these judgments right? How can questions be framed so that they can better address societal concerns? Whether and to what extent can the crowdsourcing concept be used to make our risk assessment better, but also what is needed to protect our scientific endeavor from purely value-driven interventions. So with these few thoughts, I'm looking forward to discussing all these questions and most probably many more during the next days, and to finding ideas for the best way forward. I'm confident that together with interactions with the contributions from all our distinguished speakers, experts, through hearing many different points of view, diverse expertise, we will be able to collect new insights. And we will integrate these insights into our future strategies we are starting to working on now. At the end of the conference, I'm looking forward to speaking to you again from this stage to sum up our key conclusions. Dear colleagues, conference means, literally speaking, bringing together. Now we are all here with our experiences, knowledge, ideas. We are ready to enter into one of the most fascinating human skills, to encounter each other and to exchange our views of the world. I wish you lots of encounters on many levels. Encounters with new, surprising, inspiring, exciting facts and ideas. Encounters with colleagues, strangers, like-minded and opposing thoughts for debating how to best contribute to the advancement of the common good. And last, but not least, encounters with the beauty of the human mind. experiencing empathy, solidarity, fun, respect. And if this all will be successful, finally, the creation of trust between human beings. Thank you very much for joining us, and I wish you all the best for the days in Parma. Thank you very much. With this, I will hand over to Barbara Galani and put her into her care. Barbara?
Thank you. Well done. Good afternoon and welcome to the opening session of the third EFSA Science Conference on Science, Food and Society. I welcome all participants here in Parma. I welcome our online audience, and I welcome the speakers and panelists who will be sharing their research, their thoughts, and their expectations on the theme Where Science Meets Society, putting risk assessment into context. I'm Barbara Galani, I'm Director of Communications, Engagement and Cooperation at EFSA. I will be your chair for the first part of this session. I will share this responsibility with Frédéric Simon, editor at Euractiv, who will be moderating the discussion panel, which will take place later this afternoon. To make sure that you share your voice, I strongly encourage you to download the event app if you haven't done so already, so that you can contribute to the polls. And the app will also enable you to ask questions, network, and vote on your favorite posters. So please, I'd like to see quite a lot of movement in getting your phones out, downloading the app, and getting ready for some interaction. The relevant points emerging from the speakers, the content of the presentations, the panels, and the app-generated content will provide invaluable input for EFSA as we embark on the development of EFSA's 2027 strategy. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to chair the session designed to set the scene for the rest of the conference. The main aim of the session is to address the interactions between science, risk assessment, and policy. These interactions have always been complex, and we all share the feeling that somehow they're becoming even more complex. This is probably due to a combination of factors that include, in part, some cognitive bias. It's the nostalgia bias. It's the thing that let us think that the past was always better than the present. But we also have some objective reasons linked to the way we do science, we communicate about science, and the expectations that we put on the science. As consumers of information, we sometimes get the impression that there is so much information available. We sometimes have contradictory pieces of information, and on any given topic, we feel that we are entitled to pick and choose what to believe. This session will explore approaches that can contribute to building credibility and building trust in risk assessment by better contextualizing our work and our conclusions. Our speakers will pay particular attention to the different objectives of science, risk assessment, and policy making, and to the context in which these disciplines operate. Before giving the floor to our keynote speaker, I would like to introduce the first electronic polling of the conference and seek your views on the following question. In your view, a fit-for-purpose risk assessment, 1, is based on reliable science, 2, addresses scientific uncertainties and value judgments, 3, complies with international standards and guidelines, 4, is framed by clear policy goals and therefore based on relevant science. I've lost the numbers. 6, publishes the evidence and data used 7 weighs risks and benefits. 8 is communicated properly. 9 involves society. 10 is all of the above. So you got a few seconds to get voting. And I'm going to ask our technical colleagues to now close the vote. And if possible, to display the results that we have collected. Maybe someone's still voting? If it's not possible to display the results immediately, we will collate and analyze the results, and I'll leave it to the colleague who will come after me, to Frederic Simon, to make a comparison between the voting before and after the speeches. So we'll have a number of speeches before the break, after the break, before the panel discussions. And it is my pleasure to invite on stage Silvio Funtovic, professor of the Center for the Study of Sciences and Humanities at the University of Bergen, Norway. Professor Funtovic started his career teaching maths in Buenos Aires, Argentina, was then a research fellow in Leeds, and then worked at the Institute for the Protection and Security of Citizens of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission until 2011. His talk is titled Science Meeting Society, the Old, the New, and the Uncertain in Between. Professor Funtovic, the floor is yours.
Is the clock? Have to put it on. Thank you for the invitation. As the first speaker, I think I can say thank you for the invitation and that it is a pleasure to be here. Also, it is an honor in the sense that I want to contribute to our conversation with many years of experience. First, working on the management and communication of uncertainty, and then on the development of post-normal science. All together with my colleague, Jerry Ravetz. It is also an honor to be the first speaker of this event, in a sense that fills me with responsibility, because I see that many of the things I'm going to say will be then discussed and be part of the conversation. Also, that what I'm going to say resonates with the words of Bernard Uhl before. And some of it will be a kind of repetition, but coming from a different perspective. Now, I decided that I'm going to frame my presentation using a quote from an Italian philosopher and politician, Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci, in the 30s, in prison, he wrote notebooks, and he described the crisis as a situation where the old is dying, the new cannot yet emerge, and in the meantime, you have many morbid effects. Now, so I will first talk and give an illustration on what I think is the old that is dying, what are the morbid effects, and finally, I will provide some suggestions about how can we help the new to emerge. Now, the first, as I say, I will illustrate what I think is the old that is dying using the following instance. The idea that all practical societal problems can be reduced to a techno-scientific problem that is soluble. This reduction hypothesis is foundational for the modern state. It appears precisely in the mid-1700s after Westphalia, when the new modern states were no longer based on divinity, but in science and eventually together with democracy. Now, so the idea that if you have a complex societal political problem, it is sufficient to reduce it to a technical problem, and then once you solve the problem, you have solved the practical political problem. Now, the question I want to ask is how it is possible to continue to sustain that reduction in days where, as it says in the introduction to the session, and it was in a sense mentioned by the previous speaker, you are in a situation where problems are increasingly complex, and in a world in which values are becoming more influential than facts in shaping public opinion, science increasingly mistrusted, etc., etc., etc. Can we still say that this reduction from practical, political, societal problem to techno-scientific solutions is still useful, effective? Is it still credible, or even is it still legitimate? So that will be my first point of reflection. Really, this is not a new problem. Actually, for many, many years, decades, we have been discussing this precise subject. And I want to show you from the early 70s, when Alwin Weinberg coined the term transscience to talk about the relation between outcomes from the operations of complex technological systems and possible health effects. He realized and proposed that these problems actually cannot be solved by science. I don't have the time to go into the details, but you have the reference and you can see precisely what he meant. The term transscience was picked then by Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the first head of the US Environmental Protection Agency, who argued that most of the problems coming to his attention when he was head of EPA were of a transscientific character. And he gave a definition of transscience that has become quite popular. The idea that the problems are transscientific when they can be expressed scientifically, but they cannot be solved by science. Now, in this citation, we will see that there is an addition to the definition of transscience, and that was given by Harvey Brooks, who extended the definition of transscience to problems that the previous speaker mentioned as complex problems. Complex problems. So he was then responding to the emergence of systems analysis and simulation models. And he argued that those problems that we purport to solve scientifically using these new tools, instruments, methods were also trans-scientific. Now, I want to concentrate on this issue of complexity. Because what it means by complexity is the idea that you have a plurality of interpretations or perspectives that are legitimate, but they cannot be reduced to one to the other. In a sense, those problems, complex problems, are essentially ambiguous. This ambiguity, it was recently highlighted in a correspondence in Nature in relation to precisely some ways of characterizing, evaluating evidence. So they argue that complex scientific problems, they have manifold plural interpretations. And from those plural interpretations, then some of the morbid effects can appear. And that morbid effect is that, for example, those stakeholders with more power, money, can bias the result of the interpretation in the sense of the reduction process. And that has consequences for our understanding about issues of integrity and the trust we put in a process of decision-making. Well, in an article in Nature this year, Bernard L. correctly argues that different agencies reach different conclusions is not surprising, precisely for some of the reasons I mentioned. And he says also correctly, each consider different bodies of scientific evidence and methodologies. And I would add that it's not only different bodies of evidence and methodologies, it has also to do with different remits. And the fact that agencies are part of political organizations with different aims. So what you have is the problem that different agencies solve a practical problem, let's say safety. Safety in itself is not a scientific problem. You have to operationalize the idea of safety, and in the operationalization process, what you have these possible multiple perspectives. The morbid effect of that situation is that sometimes people say, oh, there is a scientific controversy. We are confronted with a scientific controversy. But in fact, it's not a scientific controversy at all. Because if you look carefully, the problems they are solving are different. And you can say that these different problems are related somehow to one or other aspect of the practical problem. Now, a second problem related to this reduction hypothesis has been also recently discussed in a correspondence in Nature, and Bernard L. mentioned it before, and it has to do with the relation between science and trust. This is an interesting case because it refers to a recent judgment of the European Court of Justice, but I don't want to go into that detail just now. But the idea that more of sound science can create, recreate, enhance, sustain trust. And that's, again, as it was argued before me, that's another of the questions we have to discuss and reflect. Is it still possible to say that with more sound science and in particular more sound risk analysis, we are going to maintain, create, as I say, recreate, enhance trust. Now, in a sense, this idea just comes directly, is related to my first point about the reduction, right? The idea that trust can be reduced to, for example, science or factual evidence. At the end of the day, that was one of the aims of modernity, the idea that you can eliminate all value judgments and value concepts. So our question for reflection is, can we still say that this is useful, effective, credible, and even legitimate in conditions as, again, I'm showing, again, when values are becoming more influential than facts, etc., etc. That is in the introduction, in the blurb of our plenary session. Now, as I said, I gave some, in the time I have allocated, I gave some examples of what I consider elements of, or instances of the old dying, and some of the more morbid effects resulting from that. I'm now going to finish my presentation, last minutes, with some suggestions about what can we do to help the seeds of the new to emerge. And in order to do that, I will divide the tasks in 3 levels. The first I will call the technical level. The second I'm calling the institutional level. The third I will call the constitutional level. Now, on the technical level, I think you are all familiar with all the discussions about statistical inferences. Whole debate about the use of p-values, etc., etc. There is a lot of work going on, I don't need to explain it here, on improving the inferential quality of the use of statistics in science. And this has to be supported. The second element has to do also with questions about unrelated, also with reproducibility. You know, part of the crisis is, it was called the crisis of reproducibility. And there are a lot of initiatives in order to make things clearer about what is a real problem of reproducibility, what's the importance of reproducibility in science. And related to that, problems in relation to peer review, problems about technical solutions for more transparency, more technical solutions in related and work in relation to integrity, another key subject now in science, and also in relation to conflict of interests. I left for last something in which I've been working for now more 40 years, and it is the management and communication of uncertainty. And just checking the EFSA website, I found this, for example, recent document in which work I've done with Jerry Ravitz during the 80s, and it was published in our book, Uncertainty and Quality in Science for Policy, is mentioned and referenced. Now, I will pass now to what I call the institutional challenges. And that is more complicated than the technical level. And in order to do that in a brief form, I would like you to show here proposals by Sir Peter Gluckman in a recent conference. I think you are all familiar with his work as former New Zealand chief scientist and now one of the movers of the institutional aspects of science advice. So he puts it in these terms. You can see it here. And the challenges to the necessary institutional changes in order to address these issues are enormous. I'm sure also very controversial among these audiences and other audiences. But this is a proposal, and I want to suggest that explore Peter Glucksmann's suggestions is a good way to start to address the institutional challenges. Finally, I want to finish talking about what I called the constitutional level. It's a label I use. And we have heard before that we are all for empowerment, we are all for engagement, participation, we are all for transparency, we are all for diversity, and we are all for inclusion. But the challenge, and that's the next matter of reflection, is how do we incorporate those values into constitutional arrangements that were not designed with the meaning we give to those values today. Now, I think that is one of the most serious challenges facing our constitutional order that goes back to after Westphalia. And as I said before, I'm all in favor of improving the technical quality of work, as I say, statistics, etc., etc. I also think that it is also necessary to address the necessary challenges at the institutional level, but they are not sufficient. In order to fulfill and to face this challenge, we have to make sure that the technical level and the institutional level are in harmony with the necessary constitutional changes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Funtovic. I think I take a lot of inspiration from your talk and a lot of topics for further discussion. In particular, the need to acknowledge when the problem is not the scientific problem and the complexity of all the issues that are around it. So, before I give the opportunity to the delegates in the audience to ask a question, I've got good news. So we should be able to display the results from the poll. And I'll see if that is true. Here we go.
I cannot see from here.
So, cop-out answer is all of the above. Is 78% of responses. So we got a long list of topics that we will discuss with our speakers and our panelists today that 78% of the audience consider equally important in our challenge in dealing with science and society issues. So now, going back to the speech by Professor Funtovic, we got a very little time, and I'm very happy to take either a question from the audience, a question from the app, or a question from a tweet from colleagues following from online connection. Is there any question at this stage? Professor Funtavish, I think you gave us a lot of food for thought, a lot of issues that we're going to deal with in the next speeches and in the panel discussion, and I'd like to thank you very much for being here with us today. I'm very pleased to welcome on stage Professor Kevin Elliott. Kevin Elliott is Associate Professor with joint appointments in Lyman Briggs College, the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, and the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. He is a philosopher whose research focuses on the roles that values play in science and ethical issues related to scientific research. He recently published articles that explore public perception of scientists who communicate about values. And he's going to talk to us about managing values in science and risk assessment.
All right. Thank you very much. It's a treat to be here. And let's see if my slides appear. I'll go ahead as my slides come up and introduce my main claim that I want to present today, which I think ties in well with the presentation that we just saw, where I'd like to, perfect. Here we go. So what I want to suggest is that in risk assessment, and actually in science more generally, especially when we're dealing with policy relevant topics, that we'll actually do better if we strive for what I'm calling a value management ideal rather than a value-free ideal. And of course, this claim isn't new to me. Sheila Jasanoff, it sounds like, was here last time, probably raising similar issues. But I think it's always useful to sort of continue this conversation, and as a philosopher, I guess I feel like it's my role to sort of generate conversation on these sorts of issues. And so what I want to suggest is that if I can convince you that we should be adopting more of a value management ideal, we need to be thinking about how we communicate about the value judgments that enter into risk assessment and policy relevant science, and then how to make these value judgments responsibly. And I'm just going to be sketching out how we can approach this. Obviously, there's a lot more to be done, and this requires interdisciplinary work. So I'm going to explain these two ideals that I'm talking about, and then argue for why I think the value-free ideal can get us into trouble, and then offer a sketch of what's involved in this value management ideal. So just to get some terminology out of the way, when I talk about value judgments, I'm talking about choices that aren't settled by the evidence, along with basic logic and analytical principles. So these could involve questions about what we study or what questions we ask about those topics. It could involve the aims of inquiry. And then I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on details of interpretation and the models that we use for analyzing the data, the standards of evidence that we demand, and so on. And so then when I talk about values, I'm thinking about things that we regard as desirable and that can either guide these judgments, but also I really want to emphasize they could just be impacted by these judgments. So when scientists are doing risk assessment, they may not be purposely trying to promote particular values, but I'm going to be pointing out that they're making key choices that aren't settled by the evidence that can serve particular values over others, whether these be economic consideration or sustainability or public health. So again, when I talk about these judgments, they don't have to be deliberately made with particular values in mind. So when we think about the value-free ideal, I think it's this view that we should try to be excluding value considerations from central scientific activities and from risk assessment. So I have my picture of a gentleman here trying really hard not to think about values to stay as objective as possible. And I think there are reasonable reasons why this is a model that we often follow, but I want to suggest that it can get us into trouble, that perhaps it's better to think in terms of a conductor doing science, sort of managing values in the process of science and risk assessment. And again, this isn't to say that then anything goes. The point is that there are choices where even if we respect the evidence, there are decisions that have to be made that the evidence doesn't settle, or where there can be reasonable differences of opinion. So why do I think that this value-free ideal, despite there being some real strengths to it, why does it get us into trouble? Well, I think the problem is that it's typically not feasible to do policy-relevant science, let alone risk assessment, without making various choices and judgments in ways that end up supporting some values over others. And I'm going to be talking more about these on the coming slides, the assumptions and modeling choices and standards of evidence, and even the way we frame and communicate information. So by trying to sort of keep ourselves totally pure of all these value considerations, my worry is that then we fail to reflect on the ways in which these choices can serve some values as opposed to others. So just very briefly, I think that we need to think about these modeling choices, interpretive choices throughout science, actually. But this is a crowd where I think you're all particularly sensitive to these choices that enter into risk assessment. And of course, this is not a new point. All the sorts of assumptions and choices that go into trying to estimate people's exposures to potentially harmful substances, all the inference options that go into extrapolating from studies done with animals to effects in humans and especially sensitive populations, the choices involved in weighing different bodies of evidence, different studies that may need to be synthesized, choosing biological endpoints. And then I especially think this last point is interesting. There's this paper by Carl Kraner where he looked at decisions that the California Environmental Protection Agency was making back in the 1990s, where there was an alternative approach they could use for their risk assessment, where they knew it might have somewhat higher rates of false positive and false negative results, but it would generate results much more quickly. And so I think this highlights the fact that even choosing to what extent do we want to prioritize accuracy versus being able to make decisions more quickly? Again, these are judgments that have social ramifications that need to be thought about. And then in both risk assessment and policy relevant science more broadly, I think it's really significant to think about what levels of evidence we demand before we're willing to draw conclusions. Even if we're not thinking about the social ramifications, this has significant social consequences. And one of my favorite examples is when James Hansen, the prominent climate scientist, was giving testimony before Congress in 1988 in the US. And of course, a lot of the theoretical framework for predicting climate change was in place, but it wasn't clear whether one could actually say that climate change was being seen at that point. And he went ahead and said that he thought one could, and some other scientists, like this quotation I put up there, weren't so sure this was a good move on his part. But he actually very explicitly said he was thinking through the social ramifications of the levels of evidence he was demanding, and felt like when he weighed the costs of going ahead and drawing the conclusion versus waiting for more evidence, it was better to go ahead and make the claim. And so my point would be, even if the scientists aren't being as thoughtful as Hansen was in this case, that still, when they're choosing standards of evidence, whether it be at the end of an inquiry or even just in setting statistical significance levels and doing studies in various subtle ways throughout their work, that they may be making socially significant choices or judgments. And then, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but I think there are all sorts of judgments that go into how an inquiry is framed, how the results are presented, the categories that are used, and even just the terminology that are used. And on this slide, I'm just focusing on some examples of terminology. And I actually may just focus on the top example. I thought it was very interesting when the National Academy of Sciences in the US came out with this report early on about endocrine disruption, that they chose to call these substances hormonally active agents. And they acknowledged in the document that they had some conflicts within the community about what term to use. And there were concerns that using the term endocrine disruption was too sort of emotionally fraught. And perhaps it also presupposed that these hormonally active substances were actually disruptive. And so I think it just highlights even something as subtle as terminology can have these social ramifications, even if the scientists aren't purposely deciding on them. And just at the bottom of the slide, I would point out that the World Health Organization was pointing out not too long ago that even choices for, in medical terminology, for diseases can have social ramifications depending on how what terms we use. So, just to sort of wrap up my discussion of my worries with this value-free ideal, I think that scientists, when they're performing risk assessments or doing policy-relevant science, they're having to make all these judgments and choices that could either be guided by values or they may be oblivious to the values, but they may end up serving some social values over others. And so I think trying to avoid thinking about values, sort of gritting one's teeth and saying, I'm going to be totally objective here, may actually result in less thoughtful responses to deciding how to make these judgments. So, briefly then, the question is, if the value-free ideal maybe isn't a perfect ideal, what might the alternative be? And in some ways, this is sort of an embarrassingly brief sketch. What I want to do is sort of highlight the questions that I think we want to be thinking about throughout the conference and that others in other fields need to help fill out the sketch. So I think if we want to manage these judgments well, we need to be thinking about at least two aspects of scientific practice. So one is, how can we communicate effectively about these value judgments? So that we can recognize when crucial judgments are being made and think about them? And then how do we make these value judgments responsibly? While, if in fact making these choices can have these social ramifications, how do we do this? So in these slides, I first want to talk a little bit about the communication, and then I'll turn to the management, and then I'll talk about some of the issues that we need to keep thinking about. So sometimes communicating about the values that may be influencing risk assessment or science, or the value judgments, could be relatively explicit. So we talk a lot about conflicts of interest, and I think that's a relatively explicit way of saying, there may be certain values that could be influencing, consciously or unconsciously, the judgments that one is making. But then also the actual judgments themselves, in some cases we may be able to acknowledge that there are crucial choices that could yield differing results, so that then stakeholders and decision makers can better understand these. And as I was working on this slide, I found myself thinking about this paper that Fern Wixon, who we'll be hearing from a little bit later this afternoon, wrote with a co-author, Brian Wynn. And one of the points I took out of this paper that I thought was interesting is that there's this temptation to think that everybody should be able to agree about risk assessments, about the science associated with risks. And then when there's disagreement, that should come downstream when we're doing the management, when we bring in the ethical and social values that may vary culturally and so on. But I think their point, at least part of it, and what I'm trying to suggest is, if there are so many interpretive choices and judgments that go into our science and our risk assessment, well then maybe we should be more comfortable acknowledging differences in the assessments themselves. And this actually ties in with Silvio's quotation from Bernard, where he was pointing out that maybe we shouldn't be so surprised when there are differences across different bodies, given these judgments that need to be made. And I would just highlight a couple examples that, just to provide some concreteness. I thought it was interesting this past week. I've been seeing these news reports from the United States where, of course, we've had these conflicts over bisphenol A, BPA, where, a lot of academic scientists are coming up with certain results, and these are conflicting with results coming from standardized guideline studies. And so, we had this Clarity BPA project put together by our Food and Drug Administration and the National Toxicology Program to try to resolve these disagreements. And it's so interesting now. I'm seeing these reports about the FDA study coming out, and as this piece highlights, we've got this massive effort to come to agreement, and it doesn't seem to be working. Even the FDA evidence, there are conflicts over how to interpret this. And so my suggestion would be that maybe we shouldn't so much bemoan these disagreements as this calls us to provide better ways of communicating. Why are there these disagreements? What are the crucial interpretive choices or judgments that we need to think more about, that we need to communicate to the stakeholders and the decision makers so that we can understand these value judgments rather than trying to paper over them or think that these disagreements are something awful. So, and of course, I know that most of you in this room are probably more familiar with these kinds of debates about glyphosate that provide another example of how different bodies, dealing with different sorts of judgments and studies can come to different conclusions that we need to communicate about. Okay, so, but then Often communicating, I think, about these values and value judgments can be more implicit, where we may not be as clear on the interpretive choices that are making a difference. But of course, then we need a kind of transparency that allows others to identify these key choices that we may not even be aware of. And so again, this is nothing new. This is part of this huge open science movement that's such an emphasis internationally. But having more of the studies that inform the regulatory decisions be published or be made available, having open access to publications, making more of the underlying data behind publications available. In the pharmaceutical context, we've got a lot of emphasis on the registrations of studies and results and so on. And I think it's really interesting. Even, I think Bayer, in response to some of the regulations in the EU, is taking steps to make some of the data that would have only been accessible to the regulators and make it available to others. These are the kinds of steps that I think we want to keep exploring and thinking about how to make this as effective as possible. So those are some of the issues involved in communicating about value judgments, either explicitly or implicitly. But then the question is, how do we manage these value judgments responsibly? And of course, this is a huge topic, and I feel like it's almost embarrassing to just provide this little slide about this huge issue. But this is a way of getting the discussion started. So I think one of the key things we need to do, and that I discuss in my book that I had on the first slide, is to try to promote engagement so that we can better identify these value judgments and reflect on them. And I think of these steps that I have up here as kind of almost like concentric circles, where first we can have review by scientists of each other's work, whether formally in terms of peer review or more informally. I give this example at the bottom, Informing 21st Century Risk Assessment with 21st Century Science, where they're basically suggesting that a lot of the kinds of animal studies that we depend on in our risk assessment, we may need to think about the reliability of some of these when we compare them with some of the epidemiological studies that we're looking at. So I take this as an example of scientists saying, we're making some significant judgments here depending on these kinds of studies. Maybe we need to think more about this. But then bringing in social scientists, philosophers of science, and so on, to also engage in collaborations where they're thinking not just about the risk management context, but perhaps also the risk assessment context, helping to think about some of the subtle judgments that go into the assessing and the communicating of risks. And then, of course, there are steps being taken to incorporate broader communities in research in some cases, so that they may be able to help in thinking about how particular studies are designed that inform our science. And then, of course, there are multi-stakeholder institutions like the OECD that ideally are bringing together different groups so that even the design of the studies that go into our regulatory system are taking account of some of these judgments. I think we need to ask then, are these institutions actually effectively bringing together all the stakeholders that we want at the table when they're designing these studies? We need to think about that, as the speaker before me just highlighted. We need to think about these institutional structures. Are they doing what we want? And I just highlight this paper by another philosopher of science, Justin Biddle, who says in some cases, maybe we would have better engagement if we had something like a science court. Arthur Kantrowitz wrote about this in the US in Science 20 or 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago now, actually, maybe 50 years ago now, I think it was the 1970s, suggesting that in some of these cases, we could actually sort of almost have an adversarial court system where opposing sides bring together their approaches to the science, and you have some individuals who can then kind of assess so that you have a formal way of bringing these disagreements about judgments together. So just quickly, at the end of the talk, I want to acknowledge that there are some potential weaknesses to what I'm discussing, that there's a lot to be said here, and some of the questions that I think we need to ask. So first, when I talk about even explicitly discussing the judgments that enter into science and risk assessment, often scientists don't recognize that they're making these value judgments, so it's hard to ask them to acknowledge them. And if they do actually acknowledge that there might be values associated with these decisions they're making, there are concerns, could this actually damage trust? That we're trying to make the work more trustworthy, but at the same time it actually damages trust. And I note this paper working with some sociologists where we found in some cases it could actually make people more skeptical to acknowledge that there may be values in the background of the work that one did. And then my suggestions implicitly, the importance of making data available so that then people can identify potential judgments that are implicit. We need to think about the institutional framework in which this takes place. Just dumping data on the public isn't going to effectively help people to understand these judgments. We need the right sort of individuals and institutions that can make sense of this. And I would also note that there can be dangers to calls for transparency. I think some of you may have been following in the US, the Environmental Protection Agency is calling for more transparency in the epidemiological studies that inform its decisions, but there's the potential for this to actually exclude important studies because the investigators are concerned about the privacy of the individuals involved in the studies. And calls for transparency can be used to harass scientists sometimes as well. So we need to think about how we implement these efforts at transparency. And then finally, making value judgments responsibly there's a lot to be said here. And of course, others have pointed out that the outcomes of engagement efforts depend on who's involved and what are the rules for engagement and so on. And so my merely calling for engagement doesn't solve a lot of difficult ethical and political questions. So in some ways, my sketch of what a risk management ideal would look like is just the start of a big conversation. So in sum, my main point is that I'd like to push us toward more of a value management ideal as opposed to a value-free ideal as a way of facilitating better reflection about the choices that go into risk assessment. And so I think we need to think more carefully about how to promote openness about these value judgments and to make them responsibly. So thank you.
Thank you very much. You've managed to cover so much ground and to stimulate so many questions. As a reminder, please keep sending questions via your app because we can then try and answer as many as possible. So we've received quite a few, and they will be displayed on the screen. Whenever I say that, my heart skips a bit now. But one that I would like to highlight, because it's been voted by the majority of the audience, there is no science, no scientist without values. So shouldn't we just accept this and learn how to deal with it in a positive way? If you agree with this, what would you define as a positive way of dealing with this issue?
Yeah, so I think actually this question or comment really nicely captures the point that I've been trying to make, that again, there's this temptation, I think for understandable reasons, that we think, we want our science to be objective so that everybody can trust it. But the worry is that, as much as we try, that, they're still going to enter into our work. And so my two main points, trying to communicate effectively about these value judgments and then have adequate discussion through engagement about them, I guess is my sort of positive proposal moving forward. So those two key points in the latter part of the talk.
While I keep an eye out for questions from the audience here in Parma, there is another question up there. It's, I've got too many now coming up. Why the role of risk managers, political decision makers, is diminished into an object. We tend to forget their strong role in interpretation and translation. So this is probably when is the problem not just a scientific problem, sort of linked to the previous speaker.
And I guess maybe, and again, I'm sort of following in the footsteps of a number of people who have made these sorts of claims. Thinking again of Sheila Jasanoff, who was mentioned, I think that in my philosophical way, I'm suggesting that we like to think of risk assessment and then risk management being separate. And I want to acknowledge there can be some reasons why that's appealing, but I'm suggesting that sort of invariably we need a closer kind of conversation between the two, because the assessors are making choices that then shape the nature of the science or the risk assessment that they're giving to the managers. So we need to develop better ways of conversing between the two and acknowledging those choices so the assessors can communicate the key choices they're making to the managers.
If you allow me, I'm going to ask you another question because I find it quite pertinent. Are values the new uncertainty, also needing identification, characterization, and communication?
I'm sorry, could you just repeat that once more? It's helpful when I can...
Our values, the new uncertainty.
Interesting. Yeah, and maybe this in some ways gets to sort of the terminology used across different disciplines. I'm actually looking forward to the talk we're going to be hearing from David later about communicating uncertainty, because I think that that actually ties really closely with the value terminology I'm using, where this, I'm saying we need to think about how we communicate about these judgments, which you could also regard as sorts of forms of uncertainty. So I think that actually, yeah, we need to be aware that we can be talking about the same basic thing with slightly different terminology.
Thank you very much. We got many, many questions that we will keep for the panel discussions and further speakers. So thank you for your enlightening presentation. I would like to welcome on stage Dr. Philip MacDonald. Phil supervises and leads a group of scientists that coordinate the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's plant health research and diagnostic initiatives, especially those related to the applications of genomics and how these tools can inform policy. He brings his experience as the CFIA spokesperson on a number of scientific issues related to the environmental risks posed by GM crops.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation here today. So I think I'm going to take a little bit of a similar approach, and I'm glad to hear some of these themes articulated. I'm going to zero very much in on my own area of expertise, which is the environmental risk assessment as they relate to plant products of biotechnology. But I'm going to talk about that risk assessment step, problem formulation, and how maybe you can take a public articulation of values, which is policy, and you can use policy to drive that problem formulation step, to try and come to maybe more useful, first of all, more useful conclusions, and then second of all, more useful communication to the risk managers. I think one of the key things here that I've heard is as an acknowledgement of the fact that risk assessors, they're left making lots of little value judgments, lots of little judgments all the way through the risk assessment process. And I think that's something probably a lot of risk assessors don't necessarily acknowledge. They're not completely aware of themselves. So this is the power maybe in making sure that you have strong articulation of policy at the outset to make sure that risk assessors have the context to work inside. So I'm going to talk about what an environmental risk assessment is. I'm sure probably most of you are quite familiar with that. And some definitions, because generally in the risk assessment world, people tend to often use terms interchangeably. And then I'm going to talk about the use of problem formulation, and then the policy context with an example, and that example in a case study, profiling and risk assessment, and provide some conclusions. So I think probably all of you are familiar that risk is a function of hazard and exposure, and sometimes it's also called hazard and likelihood. And I guess probably if I put a leopard in here, maybe trying to attack the crocodile, we could call that risk management, and if I had somebody yelling about it to the side, we'd have risk communication. So we'd have the whole representation of risk analysis. So that falls out in a number of different ways, and what I've got here actually is, in my group, we do P&T risk, or plant with novel trait, or GM plant risk assessments, but we also do weed risk assessments. So on one hand, we're talking about our outcome is to try and determine whether something is safe for the environment. It's relatively safe in comparison to everything else. And then on the other hand, we're looking before the border, it's how risky is it? So how those things fall out is kind of different. So they operationalize differently, although really those key concepts are still kind of the same. On one hand, we've got a comparative risk assessment. We've got a series of criteria that probably most of you are familiar with: weediness, invasiveness, what happens with gene flow, plant pest potentials, non-targets, et cetera. When we talk about our things that are they as safe as all the things that we're using now. And on the pre-border side, how risky is it? What's the likelihood of it coming in and spreading and establishing itself? And here you have really a clear articulation in that kind of a weed risk assessment of economic consequences and environmental and social consequences when you think about how risky it is. So when we talk about the problem formulation step, is it policy or science driven? So policy objectives are necessary to structure the risk assessment. And we found that out in Canada firsthand when we tried to look at using plants as platforms for molecular farming. And we never came back over 10 years of satisfactory risk assessments because we didn't have the policy envelope for risk assessors to operate under. So the answers that came back to our risk managers were never the answers that they were really looking for. So without policy guidance, what we already heard, and I think that's really true, risk assessors are left to make a series of small policy decisions all the way through their risk assessments about acceptability of data and what kind of evidence to use and where to stop and what things to consider. So it's good, in Canada we were lucky and we had a clear articulation of policy, our biotech framework, so it gave really clear guidance to how we thought about products of biotechnology writ large, where they fit into the framework. We thought about them as being similar to other products. Where they fit into the societal context, well, we're going to try and see if we can foster innovation. So that gave us an idea where the regulatory bar was set. And now, as we've heard already, with the push towards big data, and we have the capacity to generate prodigious amounts of information. I heard the word tsunami of information flow, which I've heard before. And let's face it, risk assessors are trained as scientists in the first place. And many of them tend to be fairly risk averse. The profession, I think, overwhelmingly does attract people who do tend to be risk averse, and they're driven by their own curiosity. And often this kind of thing can lead scientists down fairly unproductive roads. So in terms of my talk today, and you can argue about this later from your own glossaries, but we're going to consider hazard as being any potential source of damage or harm, and risk, the probability the harm is going to result, and harm, the negative outcome from the hazard, and a pathway to harm is what we talk about. It's a series of events that need to occur for a harm to be realized, and people often talk about this in terms of being a conceptual model. In the terms of problem formulation, people talk about protection goals. So probably a common protection goal is the preservation of biodiversity. So for a risk assessor, being told that that's your protection goal and you're going to work towards conservation of biodiversity is not necessarily helpful because it's really not something targeted or useful enough for you. An assessment endpoint. The assessment endpoint is that environmental value. So when you have your idea of a protection goal, preservation of biodiversity, your assessment endpoint can be something like insect abundance and something that you can actually measure. And a risk hypothesis, it's a statement about possible outcomes such as releasing a GM crop or using a pesticide is not going to pose an unacceptable risk. So that first step in risk assessment is problem formulation, and it's also called hazard identification, maybe more commonly. And during that step, you're going to construct a series of risk hypotheses. And the beauty of this is it gives you an opportunity to break down what's really a large problem into smaller, maybe more well-articulated chunks. And that really does tends to structure and standardize the risk assessment into a more productive way, and it also allows for far better communication to risk managers. But at that point, it also means that you have to have a clear understanding of your assessment endpoints. So that your risk hypotheses are going to be based really on your assessment endpoints. And the endpoints are going to reflect what we're trying to protect. So for example, an endangered species in the environment. And it's going to reflect that societal consensus. Problem formulation also establishes the parameters of the risk assessment, also called that problem context. So the problem formulation step is where you should identify your assumptions. So when you're working through that, when you think this is where you'll figure out where your data limitations are, what you're going to need to assume, what your starting points are, and that failure to engage in proper problem formulation can compromise the entire risk assessment. So without clearly articulating where your risk hypotheses are and where your assumptions are, you can end up back to a place where you're not really coming up with a constructive communication package for the risk managers. And I think this is probably key, the endpoints are value-driven. So those endpoints really are the articulation of public policy. But the process to get to that endpoint, to determine whether there's an impact on the endpoint, that should be firmly based in science. So you really do have your articulation of public policy at that point, but the process should be scientific, and that's your defensible piece. So in the usual paradigm for GM crops is the comparative risk assessment. So your comparative risk assessment should be based on reasonable risk hypotheses that focus on realistic potential differences. So the example I'm going to use is the environmental assessment for GM crops. So it considers the relative safety of the product in both the short and the longer term, and it's comparative. So that gives you your context. It's going to be information about your new plant is going to be compared to information that's known about the biology of the counterpart, and it usually includes some kind of a molecular characterization, which will give you routes of exposure and some ideas about interactions. And it considers the expected trait in the context of the unmodified plant and considers how it can affect things we can value by using indicators that we can measure. So a good example here that ticks off a lot of boxes is monarch butterflies. So there's been a lot of discussion about those from one end or another, but you can imagine from a protection goal standpoint, this is protection of biodiversity. From an assessment endpoint standpoint, this is insect abundance. But certainly from a policy standpoint, monarch butterflies are a special concern. Not that they're necessarily endangered, but they're a species of special concern in Canada, and that's a societal consensus. Why are they a species of special concern? Because people care deeply about them. They care a lot about monarch butterflies. So we in Canada have spent a great deal of time. We've had peer-reviewed public papers related to transgenic corn, and now there's a whole discussion about how this relates to the widespread adoption of herbicide-tolerant crops. Risk assessment itself should proceed in a structured manner based on the risk hypothesis. You can use laboratory tests to identify the worst case scenario, but if the first tier of testing for the lab doesn't identify a risk, then the assessment should stop. So at this point, people usually, again, without clear guidance on how to proceed with your risk assessment, will go off and immediately launch into the next step, which is field studies, without really that clear guidance on what's the value of doing that. Why are we going out generating that information? And this can be a real value to reduce data requirements. So for your risk hypothesis, so when we think about this in context, a hypothesis that growing a certain GM crop will cause no harm is really a hypothesis that growing the GM crop will cause no greater harm than cultivation of the non-GM crop it may replace. So that's your policy articulation, that you're going to place those things in the context of things which are already being produced. So in Canada, we talk about safe as. Our policy context from the biotechnology framework is the idea that we're going to treat these, we talk about products rather than products of a process, they're actually products. So your product, it's really in terms of what's already in the environment, what kinds of things, and we use existing legislation to look at those. So we know that we're really talking, for a risk assessor, your guidance really is, that falls into the whole scope of things that we already know. So a hypothesis of growing a certain GM crop will pose no unacceptable risk is really a hypothesis that any increase in risk caused by growing the GM crop will be acceptable. And that's the valuable context for a risk assessor. So we talk about substantial equivalence in the environmental sense in Canada. So I was interviewed by Spencer Barrett from the Royal Society, and he said, how do you determine the effects on biodiversity of growing herbicide-tolerant canola? So the answer is, how do you determine the effects on biodiversity of growing canola to start with? Because we know we grow many millions of acres of canola in Canada. If you drive across the prairies, you can certainly see vast fields of yellow. So when we take that herbicide tolerance gene and put it in there, what's the overall impact? How is that different from what we're already doing? How is that greater impact on biodiversity? That's our substantial equivalence, both from the standpoint of, at a molecular level, the fact that that plant interacts with a pile of different organisms and things out there, all 30,000 genes, lots of different things out in the environment, but also it's also from the standpoint of growing that crop in itself. What are the overall effects? One of the real outcomes of that policy articulation is we see a real effect here from not just the fact that we have clear policy guidance that we're trying to we think about things in terms of what already exists, but also what the opportunities are for growers out there, which is also part of our policy context, the idea of sustainability. And we can see here from our early adoption of herbicide-tolerant crops, broad-spectrum herbicide-tolerant crops, you can see this shift towards minimum disturbance tillage. So now that almost, I think it's close to 80% of the cultivation of crop cultivation in the Canadian prairies is minimum or zero disturbance tillage. That has huge implications for carbon sequestration, for minimizing pesticide use, for soil erosion. I had a grower turn around and tell me that 20 years ago we would have been talking about soil erosion, now we're talking about GM crops. When we talk about applying the comparative approach, there's been extensive scientific research on a variety of development in plants using a wide variety of genetic tools. So we all know about, we heard earlier discussion about genome editing. I would argue that maybe the issues are going to be the same no matter how you're going to produce your product. But there's one thing we know, that the advancements in molecular analysis techniques have given us an unprecedented understanding of plant genomes and the kinds of things that occur in there. So profiling of GM crops can be carried out at the molecular level. You can use transcriptomics, you can use metabolomics, you can use proteomics. And then this issue was actually recently discussed in the recent report from the National Academy of Science that talked about the future of risk assessment and using those kinds of profiling technologies as a mechanism for enhancing risk assessment. And this is a powerful tool for generating a great deal of information to identify statistically significant differences. But is it really a useful tool for helping us identify differences we care about in the context of risk assessment? So without that prior policy context, science-led profiling can encourage the idea that producing more data inevitably leads to a better risk assessment. So more data doesn't necessarily mean more precision. What it really can do is lead you to a place where you just have more questions. So what you really end up in is questions you can no longer answer, yet more uncertainty, and maybe not good communication back to risk assessors. The purpose of the regulatory risk assessment is to evaluate whether the risks posed by a specific use or product are acceptable. So in that context, identifying significantly different differences between the plant is not necessarily going to lead you to an outcome where you're going to have a realistic appreciation or communication about risk. The acceptability of the risk is ultimately a policy decision. So in Canada, we have our context. Our policy context is the biotech regulatory framework, which articulates what kind of boundaries and bars we have for our risk assessment. But those are really societal decisions. They aren't things that are going to come out from a risk assessor going through looking at statistically significant differences. So profiling can be useful as guided by hypothesis rather than looking for differences. And at the end, I'm going to give you a cogent example of how we've tried to apply that in Canada. We've used profiling technologies to come up with what we think is a useful piece of scientific advice after having guided by hypothesis. So regulators have specific needs, and we should be applying a hypothesis-driven analysis guided by policy. We know that risk assessors are trained as scientists and driven by curiosity. And I think that's probably everybody who's been in the risk assessment has heard that term about need to know versus nice to know. So sometimes information that you're requesting, is this information you're requesting because it makes me feel better as a scientist, or it gives me a greater sense of comfort, or I have more information? Or is this really something that I'm asking because it's a necessary piece of information to me determine whether there's a realistic risk I'm being addressed? And do I have a hypothesis that's really addressing that? And this is really a challenge I put to my own risk assessors, because the decisions that you're making through your risk assessment have real consequences. So next time you go out and generate, a question based on something which is maybe specious, and I know we've certainly been guilty in my own group of looking around and asking questions on genes that we've characterized and know really well. So do we really need to demand another feeding study? Do we really need to go out and ask for another toxicity study? Because really, those animals are going to be sacrificed. So how many rats need to die to demonstrate safety when we really don't have expectations of harm? So the risk assessment needs the policy context. There needs to be a clear idea of what the endpoint goals will be for the risk assessment. So you really need to have that clear articulation at the outset to avoid that kind of ongoing value-driven risk assessment as you run through there. And clear policy can help risk assessors who are called upon to make decisions about data throughout the risk assessment. So I think that's been articulated several times here, that there is that necessity of going back, looking through the risk assessment, making those decisions as you go along, and trying to figure out how you're going to use data and where your important decision points are. And I know I've had this discussion with risk assessors that you really need to be clear about how you're getting through what is mostly a qualitative process. And science without a policy context can lead risk assessors down unproductive avenues or lead to unfocused data collection, which is really just as unhelpful because you're really being called upon to make a decision. And if you're not making a decision, you know, though your decision, there's a decision and an opportunity cost to be had there. And back to my example with the uptake of zero disturbance tillage in Canada as a consequence of the widespread adoption of herbicide-tolerant crops. The discussion between risk manager and risk assessors is critical, and I think that's something that we heard earlier. To ensure risk assessment provide value to decision makers, and that's that real policy piece inside there, and that need to have that close interconnection between the risk assessor and the risk manager. So I'd like to finish up with maybe a little bit of self-promotion here. Inside Canada, we've developed, I think, probably something which is relatively unique, and that's an articulated piece of science advice which is peer-reviewed and published. And this represents the outcome from my colleagues at Health Canada for food, my colleagues also at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency concerned with livestock feed, and my group that does the environmental risk assessment. And we looked at a lot of the profiling data that's been generated, the kind of data that's been generated around plant genomics and plant genomes, some of the things, some of the effects which occur inside genomes like homologous end joining and transposons moving around, recombination, chromosome doubling, some of the things that happen inside plant genomes. And we thought about that in our own policy context, which is the comparative risk assessment. So inside the comparative risk assessment, what does that mean? So when we came back to that, there's a lot of discussion about, well, you know, the harm of inserting genes into a plant. So we said, really, when we look at that comparatively, inserting a gene into a plant fits into that whole same context of what happens when you're already happening in genomes, the kind of things that happen with conventional breeding. So what we came back to after that as a policy determination is we don't need to look at every single solitary transformation event if we're putting the same genes in there, because really, we don't look at the products of conventional breeding, we don't look at the things that come out of it afterwards, so why would we be doing that? So as a policy articulation that comes from science, back the other way, why do we need to look at each and every transformation event? And with that, I'll thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. MacDonald, for this view from the other side of the ocean. And let's see if there are any questions that were submitted during your talk through the app. And I will try to also keep an eye out if there is anybody who wants to ask questions in person. Here one. Based on your presentation, what practical steps should risk assessors or risk managers take to ensure real value for decision makers?
Yeah, so I think again, we go back to the same comment that there needs to be a clear articulation at the outcome, what the expectations are from those risk managers. And I think that what we have always found is that the policy context is critical, that if we're going to generate things, and I go back to my example of molecular farming, using plants as platforms for production of high-value molecules, we always ended up in a place where the information we were providing back to risk managers wasn't serving their purposes because we didn't have a clear policy of what it was we were trying to achieve inside the risk assessment.
Maybe we can take the next one. I think that unfortunately many risk managers and food safety scientists are not still able to deal with terminology and basic mechanisms, concepts of risk assessment. Do you agree? Does this issue affect significantly the work done by risk assessors and the full potential of their results?
I think we maybe because inside I live in a little bubble where we have a small community, but I think that's probably very true when we start talking to people from the other parts of the agriculture sector that we work with. That's most assuredly something we spend a lot of time educating people about is really the process of risk assessment and a better understanding of the terminology. I think we've spent a long time defending our original policy decision of having a product-based approach to really people who don't truly understand what that means in real terms and where those scientific decisions came from.
Thank you very much. There are a lot of questions on value judgments. There are a lot of questions on the presentations previously. Please keep sending questions. We'll try and address as many as possible during the panel discussion. So it's now time for a break. The great value of conferences, as Bernard was saying at the beginning, is really to get to exchange views with people who think in the same way, with people who think very different. And we have the opportunity of a coffee, which is going to be served just outside in the catering area, to spend about 30 minutes with each other. So I'll reconvene at 5 to 4 for 2 more speeches and then the panel discussion.